riding into Jerusalem and cleansing the temple. So for me also, it was a learning experience to learn that the image of course, Jesus was taken from the Maccabees, the story of the Maccabees. And I'll just read part of it, the appropriate part of it. That's the story of Hanukkah, that they rededicated the temple because Antiochus put a statue in the middle of the sanctuary, and that was, of course, idol worshiping, and they cleansed the temple. Now, the Maccabees were priests. They were from the family of priests. So they were not really trained originally as warriors, but they were very dedicated to cleanse and reclaim the temple. So they were brave warriors, and they won the battle. But we don't celebrate necessarily the battle. We, of course, we acknowledge that there was a military battle, that it was one of the miracles in the Hanukkah story. But ultimately, we don't celebrate that. We celebrate the spirituality of it, right? That the menorah, the oil lasted for 8 days in that little jar. That's what we really celebrate. They were priests. They were the spiritual component of the temple. However, after their victory, they took upon themselves to be kings as well. And the Talmud says this is when the destruction of the temple ultimately started. Because they did not, in a sense, learn the lessons from themselves. That the victory ultimately is not by the power. They took something that was not part of their jurisdiction. They acted like the kings of the nations with power, instead of realizing that they won themselves. They won the ultimate war against the Greeks, the powerful Greek Empire, with a few soldiers, but with God. So we go back to the idea that of cleansing, and that happened, as it says here, it happened on the second month of the 23rd, on the 23rd day of the second month, in the 171st year. The Jews entered it with praise and palm branches, and with harps and stringed instruments, and so forth. So they was a big celebration. So, first of all, the 171st year, I had to research that. Of course, it's from when the Greeks took possession of Jerusalem. And that happened in the year 332 BCE. So if you take 171 from 332, it brings you to 161 BCE, which is exactly when the story of Hanukkah happened according to our sources. So they come into the temple, and up until now, I thought that clearly this is for Christians. This becomes Palm Sunday, right? And for many years, I had a question in my mind. I don't know any Jewish celebration or ritual that involves palm branches that is not in the time of Sukkot. When we do the branches with the lulav, it's after the high holidays. It's the last holiday within the month of Tishrei. We have the Rosh Hashanah, then Yom Kippur, and then Sukkot, the holiday of Tabernacle. And that's the only really holiday that we have. Although palm trees are available in Israel all year round, so they could have celebrated then. So then when I read this source, that it's really the second month, it could be more, because the first month is always referred to Nisan. the month of Passover, which means this may have been a little bit after Passover somehow, so it may not have been the same year that according to the ritualistic year in Christianity, Jesus came into Jerusalem before Passover and then was taken. It could have been that this incident with the temple, when he walked in, was maybe a year before, started that year, in the beginning of that ritual year. But leaving that aside, the idea of getting into the temple and what was in Jesus' time, if we talk about the statue in the middle of the sanctuary, what was the idol worshiping that Jesus saw going on in the temple at his time? So, as Don mentioned, it wasn't per se the trading, the money. First of all, there's no problem with having money even on the Sabbath. Originally, there was no issue with having money on the Sabbath. But it's a rabbinic law to prevent us from engaging in trading on the Sabbath. But the temple had its own rules. I'll give you an example. The most known law of the Sabbath that violates the Sabbath, there are a few, but the one written in the Torah was lighting a fire. Right? You can't light fire on the Sabbath. However, the temple was its own its own entity with its own rules, because they were bringing sacrifices even on the Sabbath. Not only were they bringing the regular sacrifice, they were bringing additional sacrifice. So the fire was not an issue in the temple. It really is because the Sabbath is for us to rest, right? But God rested on the Sabbath. But in the temple, it's eternal, right? It's the eternal light, it's eternal, it's God. So it has different rules. So what really bothered Jesus within those, that he had to flip those tables, right? So those tables were for the purpose of trading and buying the sacrifices, right? The offerings, the animals that would then be offered. The problem is that they started negotiating with people who, let's say, didn't have enough money to buy a bull, right, which was an expensive offering. So they would get more money. And then the priest would have more residuals from that big sacrifice offering. Instead, they were trading and actually pushing aside the smaller offering. So basically, when poor people came to offer, they pushed them aside. And that is the idol worshiping, the ultimate idol worshiping. Why? Because ultimately, it's not even about the animal that you bring to the altar. It's not. God tells us, I own the whole world. I have everything. So I don't need your cows and chickens. What I do need is your intention, your heart, to be in it. So if you're negotiating and you don't understand, just like that at the end of chapter 12, when the woman who brings her penny, right, but she brings it out of her poverty, that's her offering is greater than anybody else's offering that may bring it from the wealth they have. So once you push that aside, you're not worshiping God. You're worshiping somebody else or something else. Whether it's an idea, whether it's money, mammon, that is ultimately the idol worshiping. So that is the idea of getting into Jerusalem and cleansing the temple.